Hi, good morning. So, great to be here. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our company, Celixir. So, Martin Evans and myself founded the company Celixir in 2009. It was formerly called Cell Therapy Limited. We founded the company to discover and develop life-saving and life-altering cellular therapies. We have multiple cell and gene therapy platforms that we utilize. I guess you would call us a technology agnostic company. So our purpose, our focus is to produce novel medicines. Those medicines are all allogeneic, and currently all of those have been invented in-house. We have a portfolio of products in late-stage clinical trials, so phase 2B for heart failure and phase 3 for tendon regeneration. And we have a relatively strong preclinical pipeline, which includes some gene therapies and some oncology programs, as well as further cardiovascular programs. As I mentioned, we do most of the work in-house, including discovery, research, development, regulatory, and we have our own GMP manufacturing facility. We have a number of partnerships, including scientific advisors and clinical trial PIs based in the US, in the UK, Singapore, and a partnership with Daiichi Sankyo in Japan for our lead product, Heart Cell, that we completed last year. This is a sort of summary of our pipeline. The key elements, as I mentioned, and I don't know if this has got a pointer. It probably hasn't. The key elements I mentioned is Heart Cell, which is starting a phase 2B trial in heart failure, and Tendon Cell, which is starting a phase 3 trial. And then what you see in the cardiac arena is two different cell types. Heart Cell is an immunomodulatory progenitor cell, and myocardion is a progenitor cell of mesodermal lineage. Both of those cells are quite distinct and quite different from mesenchymal stromal cells. So these are cells with a very different phenotype and a different cell surface receptor profile. Those are novel cells that have been patented. Similarly, Tendon Cell is another product that we created in-house, and I'll talk you through some high-level results. And then, as I mentioned, we have an early portfolio in oncology that we're progressing to clinic. A little bit about the team. So Martin Evans won the Nobel Prize for his work in stem cells in 2007, and he's our Chief Scientific Officer. I worked at Roche, where I was Global Head of Emerging Technologies, and prior to that, M&A Director. Our new board, which has recently been configured, includes Mubasher Sheikh, who's another founder of the company and is head of healthcare at Primera, Fiona Murray, who is a professor at MIT, Gary Pisano, who's a professor at Harvard, Darren Disley, who is a PhD from Cambridge in England, and former CEO of a large public company in the UK, and Chaim Horowitz, who is part of the VC CH Health from Teva. Some very quick clinical trial results. So this is a trial that we completed in 2016, which is the phase 2 trial, where we looked, this is the allogeneic heart cell product, and this is originally a phase 1/2 trial where we were originally just looking for safety signals. We're very pleased that the safety of this product was very good, and that across all 3 endpoints we saw significant efficacy. The key marker perhaps to look at is the scar size reduction, which is the bottom left. The reason that's key is because that's a surprising and unusual result in patients undergoing bypass. Usually when you have bypass surgery, and it's good bypass surgery, you'll see an improvement in ejection fraction, and you probably see an improvement in quality of life. But it's very, very unusual, to the point that it's not recorded in the literature, to see scar reduction in patients with chronic heart failure in scar that is metabolically inactive. And that's really the critical driver that led us to perhaps look at this and think, for the first time, we're seeing myocardial regeneration. So the scar size reduction is indicative of myocardial regeneration. With tendon cell, we did a more traditional trial. So this is a double-blind, placebo-controlled study looking at the traditional markers that you would look for in tendon regeneration. So this is tennis elbow. And you see a significant improvement above and beyond placebo in both DASH and PRTE. And if you're not familiar with tendon regeneration, DASH is a functional measure and PRTE is a pain score. So these are two different scores. We also looked at a secondary marker, which was grip strength, which is the marker that the industry is more concerned with. And again, we saw approximately 40% improvement in grip strength. The phase 3 trial for this product will start later on this year. Thank you.
Well, great. Well, let's start with hard cell. Can you talk to us about the characteristics of your cell that you believe could make it successful in treating congestive heart failure?
Sure. So the core hypothesis that we started off with heart cell was, and you've got to remember this is back in time, so many of you remember the sort of dark days of 2009, 2010, where we didn't have specificity in our cellular therapies. So when Martin and I were designing this product back in 2009, we were trying to, or our aim was to create a cell type that was both tissue specific, so cardiac, and functionally specific. So a cell that would drive scar reduction, which we believe was critical before you could regenerate the heart. And so what we tried to do there was to modulate the cell surface receptors to make our cell, the immunomodulatory progenitor cell, heart specific, and then also to look for factors that would have an anti-fibrotic effect.
So as you move into the phase 2B, what questions and what efficacy are you trying to further demonstrate in this study?
Sure. So we've, as you'd expect, we've spent a lot of time talking to the FDA and the EMA. The product already has a CTA for the clinical trial in Europe, and we're in the process of filing now for the IND in the US. The clinical trial tackles two different measures. One is the functional improvement, which is the scar reduction, so the proof that we are actually seeing regeneration. And because we're in heart failure, we also have to demonstrate an improvement in MACE, major adverse cardiac events. So coupling those two things together is really critical. A little bit following on from the keynote this morning from Dr. Hai from Spark, I think matching functional improvement to the known clinical outcome measures is really critical if you want to do trials that will be broadly accepted, and that's our aim.
So in your discussions with the regulators, do you have clarity on what measures of efficacy they're going to require in order to allow for commercialization?
Yes, absolutely. And probably at two different levels. So we have, I think, clarity, certainly in Europe, what would be required for a conditional approval, plus what will be required for a full approval. And similarly in the US, what would be required for an accelerated approval.
So you have the phase 2 data. You had certainly considered filing for conditional approval with the EMA. So what do you think you need to show here in order to get that approval, marketing approval?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. I think the first thing is our original hypothesis was based on a very small patient group. So back in 2010, we thought of this perhaps as a product for end-stage heart failure. The advice we got from the regulator was actually the label should be much broader. So in the phase 2B trial, both in the US and in Europe, we'll be looking at patients in New York 2 and New York 3 heart failure, so mild to moderate heart failure. In that group, it wouldn't be appropriate to file for a conditional approval with the data that we have. So the next trial, the phase 2B trial, would certainly be sufficiently powered and would appropriately cover the population to allow for a conditional approval if the efficacy results are replicated.
Okay, so from where we're standing today, what's your best guess in terms of when we might see some data from these studies?
2020.
Okay. Very good. Let's move on to the application with your tendon product and tennis elbow. So can you expand a little bit about what you saw in that clinical study?
Certainly. So this is a double-blind placebo-controlled study in patients that have severe tennis elbow. So these are patients that typically would require surgery within 3 to 6 months, such that they don't have normal function anymore. One of the early patients was actually an orthopedic surgeon who was no longer able to operate. And so these patients have had chronic tennis elbow for 6 months to a year. And what we did in the clinical trial was 21 days of application of a topical gel. And what we were trying to do there is the hypothesis is by avoiding the needle stick injury from a steroid injection plus the side effects of a steroid injection, can we actually drive regeneration of the tendons such that we could delay surgery? That was the hypothesis. And as I mentioned, the clinical trial measures, so the primary endpoints were DASH, which is a functional measure, and PRTEE, which is a pain measure. But also we looked at grip strength, and grip strength is really the industry standard to see if you get functional improvement. And what we saw was that patients that had a very poorly affected arm were able to bring their grip strength up to the same level as the unaffected arm. So at the beginning of the trial, there was a significant difference between grip strength in affected versus non-affected, and by the end of the trial, there was no difference, in addition to the statistically significant and very clinically significant improvement in both DASH and PRTE.
So similar, as you move forward with this program, talk about the design of the next trial you're going to do.
So this is a large, or relatively large, phase 3 clinical trial, multi-center, with around 250 patients, powered for the clinical. So the regulatory endpoint for tennis elbow is pain reduction. So it's reduction in symptoms. But we're also using the secondary endpoint of grip strength again, and the trial investigates whether this is a regulatory approvable product.
And in terms of measuring pain, it can be somewhat subjective. So is there a validated assessment tool that you're using to do that?
Absolutely. So both DASH and PRTEE are the two validated tools specifically for tendon injury and specifically for tennis elbow tendon injury. Okay,
so very good. So again, from where we're standing today, when do you think we might get data from that study?
I'm going to say 2020 again. Yeah, it may be quicker, but our prediction is 2020.
And is that a US-based study? What's the plan there?
The first trial is in Singapore, and then I think we're looking at multiple options in terms of how we bring that trial to both Europe and the US.
Okay, well, very good. Well, thank you very much.